Hi, my name is Dr. Kelly Canavan, and I'm here to discuss my systematic review on the impact of verbal speech of children who use speech sharing devices. This review was completed as my final culminating project under the mentorship of Dr. Megan Roberts for the clinical doctoral program at Northwestern University. There are many rationales for diving deeper into the effects speech sharing devices have on a verbal output in children. Many parents and caregivers are often hesitant to implement a speech sharing device due to fears of this tool discouraging the development of verbal speech. Previous studies have debunked these beliefs. However, not all of the AAC devices that were involved produced a voice output. This is important to note because my clinical experience has been with children increasing their verbalizations when there has been a consistent verbal model produced from a speech sharing device, and they're able to then imitate that model. The purpose of diving deeper into the research is to seek understanding about the impact of AAC on spoken language outcomes. And the results of this research will then be helpful in providing education to families, caregivers, and healthcare providers, as well as guide future research that further analyzes the effects of speech sharing devices on verbal speech. The aim of this systematic review was to examine the effects implementing a speech sharing device on a child's verbal output. So let's dive into how the research was actually gathered. And so this research was gathered for this review, and all the articles were retrieved from Scopus on November 20th, 2019. And they utilized search terms such as verbal speech, language, variations of AAC, and augmentative communication, as well as speech sharing devices. There were initially 2,360 citations, and of that initial number, 2,236 citations were excluded based on not being written in English, inclusion of adult participants, and a focus of identification on the barriers of AAC rather than the actual use of AAC. Another 113 articles were excluded following the full text review due to focusing solely on low-tech and/or mid-tech devices, as well as the creation of AAC systems and measuring only receptive language growth. So 11 studies were fully coded and met all of the researchers' criteria, and an additional 2 studies were included after conducting a backward search on 421 citations. A grand total of 13 studies were fully coded for this systematic review. And so the fact that the starting number was 2,360 and ended with 13 just means that there needs to be an increase in the research on the use of speech sharing devices and verbal speech development. And now we'll talk a little bit about the results. So from these 13 research articles, 12 of the 13 studies had relatively small sample sizes between 1 and 15 participants, with 69% of the participants falling between the ages of 5 and 7 years, 11 months. As well as 10 of the studies included 75 to about 100% male participants, and the children with diagnoses of autism made up 69% of the participants, with the second highest diagnosis being apraxia of speech, with approximately 16% of the participants being represented in these studies. When analyzing the participants' communication, as you can see on the pie chart in the top left, 64% of the participants were either characterized as having limited verbal output, which meant that their verbal speech was 25% or less, or being primarily verbal. This is really important to note because parents and therapists will not typically consider speech sharing devices as an option, thinking that their child's verbal speech is enough. However, the participants in these studies were reported to be highly unintelligible, fatigue rather quickly when communicating verbally, or they would rely on a communication partner to interpret their needs and then provide them with a verbal model to then imitate. Another result that was important to note was the differences in how verbal speech was measured. If you look at the bar graph in the middle, you will see 7 different ways that 13 studies measured verbal speech. 6 of the studies utilized measuring spontaneous utterances, while 5 of the studies measured total spoken words, and only 4 studies measured mean length of utterance. The early echoic skills assessment, which is a tool used by behavior therapists, was also used in 2 studies, as well as intelligibility, imitation of vocalizations, and rhyme assessments that were each used in a single study. The types of communication attempts are also varied, with 38% of the studies measuring all verbal communication attempts and only 23% of the studies measuring only the child's requests or commands. So something that's important to note from here is that only 62% of the studies were published in a dedicated speech language pathology or AAC journal. And that led to a lot of variation in these measurements. The line graph that you see on the top right, this displays the research that was conducted by Luke in 2016, and this measures the intelligibility and a reported growth of 38.6% after implementing a speech generating device. The bottom graph depicts the 5 studies that measured total verbalized words, with 3 of them reporting percentages of increased total verbalized words between 150% to 320% following the intervention with a speech generating device. 2 of the studies also measured the percentage of total utterances, and they demonstrated growth of 73% and 148% following the intervention with a speech generating device. So in conclusion, all studies reported a positive relationship between the implementation of speech generating devices and verbal speech. 3 studies reported statistical differences in verbalizations following intervention with a speech generating device, and 1 actually computed a positive effect size of 0.22 when compared to the control group that did not have a speech generating device present. So the results suggest that participants' production of spoken words, and utterances increased when paired with a speech generating device. In this systematic review, the age of the participant did not appear to matter or have an effect, as the study with the highest total number of utterances had a mean age of 6.2 years, and the study with the highest percentage of increased verbalized words had a mean age of 2.7. Therefore, my next steps are going to be to examine the effects of speech generating devices that they have on verbal speech of adolescents as well as adults. And so to be sure that I'm coming up with the same results, the same search terms are going to be used and the same code book will also be utilized to ensure that there's consistency across these reviews, as well as help with identifying any patterns that are from either this review or seen in future ones, and comparing this to the future review of adults and adolescents. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions and I hope that you enjoyed.